Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The sun was high over the Arizona desert, casting its brutal rays down on the earth with merciless force. The canyon floor was dry and cracked, the heat searing the air. Every breath felt like inhaling fire as the wind kicked up dust, swirling it around like a living thing. A long stretch of emptiness lay before the lone man, the silence punctuated only by the screech of cicadas that seemed to vibrate the very air. Elias Boone had been walking for hours. His boots kicked up loose gravel, crunching with every step as he moved along the narrow trail. The canyon walls loomed on either side, painted in hues of red and orange, their sharp contours making it feel as though the land itself was pressing in on him. It was the summer of 1879. The Arizona Territory, and Elias had no particular destination in mind. He was a man without a purpose, a man with a past that had left him hollow, stripped of the pride he once had. At 42 years old, Elias had lived enough for a dozen men. His hands were calloused, his face weathered, and his soul, well, it was a stranger even to him. He had once been a scout for the Union Army, but the war had been a long time ago, and it had stripped him of more than just his uniform. The war was a memory that followed him like a shadow, constantly creeping up in his dreams and thoughts. He'd lost comrades, men he'd promised to protect, men who had died because of his mistakes. His past was one of blood, of death, and of a country torn apart by conflict. But it was over now. The war was done, and what remained was just a wasteland of his own thoughts. Elias no longer believed in the flag he had once fought under. His days in the cavalry had ended, and now all that was left was the quiet of the desert. He carried a scar above his right eyebrow, a mark from a cavalry saber, a reminder of battles long past. His movements were slow but steady, his eyes scanning the land ahead for any sign of trouble. He had learned long ago that out here, in the vast emptiness of the Arizona desert, trouble was always lurking. His fingers itched for the bottle of whiskey that had long been a companion in the darkest moments. But he hadn't touched a drop in 3 years. Still, the pullet was always there, just behind his ribs, whispering to him in the quiet of the night. As he rounded a bend in the canyon, he stopped. His boots came to an abrupt halt, and he squinted into the distance. Ahead, standing at the mouth of a small cave, was a figure, a woman, her back pressed against the rock wall. The sight of her made Elias pause. She was young, maybe no more than 20. But there was something wild about her. Her clothes were torn, and her dark hair was tangled in loose braids that had come undone. She stood like a trapped animal, her body coiled tight, ready to spring at a moment's notice. Elias didn't move. His hand hovered near his side, ready to draw his gun if necessary, but something told him to hold off. She hadn't noticed him yet. And then she spoke. Her voice cracked through the silence of the canyon, sharp and cutting, like the wind itself had a voice. "Why do you have a rattlesnake between your legs, cowboy?" The words echoed across the canyon, and for a moment, Elias was too stunned to move. The woman was holding a large rock in both hands, her body tense as she glared at him. She was looking directly at his hip, where his lariat hung, coiled and ready to be used. In the blinding heat and the glare of the desert sun, it did resemble a snake ready to strike. Elias blinked, the tension in the air thick enough to cut. He could feel the heat of the desert pressing in on him, and he knew he had to act quickly. The woman's fear was palpable, her eyes wide and wild, filled with something darker than just suspicion. Slowly, Elias lifted both of his hands, palms facing outwards. His voice was calm, but his words were carefully measured. "It's just a rope, miss. Just a rope. Nothing alive." The Apache woman didn't lower the rock. Instead, she stood frozen, her eyes darting between him and the coil of rope at his side. Elias could feel the air tense between them, the silence stretching out. He took a step back, his movements slow and deliberate, making sure she could see every action. He unhooked the lariat from his belt and dropped it to the ground with a dull thud. Her grip on the rock loosened just slightly, but she didn't lower it entirely. Her breathing was shallow, rapid, and Elias could see the fear in her eyes. He didn't want to make any sudden moves that would scare her into doing something she might regret. He knew that fear could be deadly, And out here in the desert, a frightened woman with nothing to lose could be as dangerous as any outlaw. "I'll walk past," Elias said softly, his voice steady. "I won't touch you. I'll just walk past." He could feel her eyes on him as he moved slowly along the canyon wall, careful not to block her escape route. The tension in the air was so thick it could be cut with a knife. He wasn't sure whether she would attack or run, but he knew one thing for certain. He had to move cautiously. If she attacked, he'd have to defend himself. But he didn't want that. He didn't want to hurt anyone, especially not someone who seemed to be as lost and desperate as he was. It wasn't until he was nearly past her that she lowered the rock, but the silence still held. Elias didn't look back at her, but he could feel her eyes on his back as he walked away. He had no idea who she was, but something told him that their paths had crossed for a reason. He could feel the weight of the decision that had been made between them, unspoken but real. Neither of them had walked away. Not yet. And so Elias kept moving forward, and the Apache woman, whom he didn't yet know as Nayline, followed him from a distance, her back still to the rock, her gaze still fixed on his every movement. As they moved deeper into the desert, Elias kept his pace steady, his eyes constantly scanning the land for any signs of trouble. The Arizona heat was unrelenting, and every step felt like it cost more than the last. The dry scrub and rocky terrain seemed to stretch on forever, with no end in sight. Elias had seen this land before, had crossed it countless times as a scout, but today it felt different. There was an unfamiliar weight on his shoulders, a sense of tension that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just the heat. It was a woman behind him, following silently, always staying a few paces back. He knew she was there, could feel the weight of her gaze on him, but he didn't ask why she followed. Some things didn't need to be said. She had her reasons, and for now, that was enough. They walked in silence for hours, the desert stretching out around them like an endless ocean of sand and rock. The only sound was the crunch of their boots on the dry earth and the occasional call of a hawk soaring high above. Elias didn't speak, and neither did she, but he could tell she was watching him, studying his every move, as though trying to figure out what kind of man he was. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the canyon, Elias decided it was time to stop for the night. He found a small outcrop of rocks that offered some shade and shelter from the wind. He dropped his pack with a grunt and pulled out his water canteen. His throat was parched, the dry air sucking the moisture from his body faster than he could replace it. He took a long drink, then offered the canteen to the Apache woman, who had stopped a few paces away. She hesitated, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. Elias didn't push her. Instead, he simply held a canteen out in her direction, the gesture offering nothing more than what it was. A small act of kindness, nothing more. She approached cautiously, her steps quiet but deliberate, and took the canteen from his hand. She drank quickly, swallowing greedily as if she hadn't had water in days. When she handed it back, Elias didn't ask any questions. The look in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. She was thirsty, but not just for water. She was thirsty for survival. And she wasn't sure yet whether Elias could be trusted. "I'm Elias," he said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was rough from the dust in the air and the heat of the desert. She looked at him, her eyes sharp and calculating. "Nayline," she replied, her voice hoarse but steady. The name sounded foreign to Elias, but he nodded. He didn't ask any more questions. Not yet. They both sat down, their backs against the rocks, and the silence stretched between them again. Elias tried to clear his mind, but the words from earlier echoed in his head. "Why you have a rattlesnake between your legs, cowboy?" The question had caught him off guard, and he wondered if there was some hidden meaning behind it. Was she asking about the rope? Or was there something else she saw in him that he couldn't see in himself? He shook the thought away and focused on the task at hand. They needed rest, and they needed to conserve their resources. The sun would be back up soon enough, and with it, more danger. The desert didn't wait for anyone. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Elias started a small fire. The light flickered against the rocks, casting long shadows on the ground. He had no idea where they were going, only that they couldn't stay here for long. There were places in the desert where people could disappear forever, and Elias knew that once you went down that road, there was no turning back. Nayline sat a few feet away, her back to the fire, her face partially hidden in shadow. Elias could see the way her hands trembled slightly, but he said nothing. She had her demons, just as he did. The fire crackled between them, the sound of it filling the silence that neither of them was willing to break. As the fire burned down to embers, Elias stretched out on his bedroll, his thoughts drifting. He had lived a long life of solitude, and the silence between him and Nayline wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence that he had learned to embrace, one that allowed him to carry his own burdens without needing to share them. The desert had taught him that the only way to survive was to keep moving, to keep walking no matter how heavy the weight of the past. But as he lay there, staring up at the stars, Elias couldn't help but think of the woman behind him. She wasn't just another wanderer. There was something in her eyes, something desperate yet strong. She had seen things he didn't need to know, but he felt that he might be able to help. He didn't know how, but there was something inside him that told him he couldn't just leave her to fend for herself. Maybe it was the guilt he carried with him, the burden of the men he had lost in his past. Maybe it was just a simple fact that he couldn't stand to see someone else suffer alone. At the crack of dawn, Elias woke to the sound of soft footsteps. Nayline was already up, her body bent over as she gathered her belongings. She moved quietly, efficiently, as though she had done this many times before. Elias watched her for a moment, then got up slowly, his joints stiff in the cold of the night. The fire was out, and the air had already begun to warm. The desert was waking up. He didn't speak as she packed her things. She didn't look at him, but Elias could feel the weight of her gaze. She was sizing him up, just as he had done with her. The question in her eyes was the same one that had burned in his chest for days. Why are you helping me? The silence stretched, but neither of them was ready to voice the question. Finally, after a long moment, Elias spoke. We need to keep moving. The water here is running low. Nayline nodded, her movement slow but steady. She didn't ask where they were going, and Elias didn't offer an answer. They had no destination, only the open desert ahead of them. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only one they had. They walked in silence for hours, the heat rising higher with every step. The land around them was barren, nothing but dry scrub and sharp rocks. Elias felt the weight of the heat pressing down on him, his throat parched and his body aching from the constant motion. He glanced back at Nayline, but she was too far behind to read her expression. She was still following, still walking beside him, though neither of them had said a word since the fire had died. By midday, the air shimmered with heat. The land felt as though it was baking under the sun, and Elias could feel his strength beginning to wane. He knew they had to find water soon, or they wouldn't make it much farther. But the desert had its own plans. As they crested a ridge, Elias saw a small figure ahead of them. At first, he thought it was a mirage, but then it moved. A man, riding a horse, slowly making his way toward them. As the man on horseback approached, Elias felt a sudden shift in the air. There was something about the way the rider sat on his horse, tall, confident, yet not aggressive. The horse's hooves clicked softly against the dry earth, a sound that seemed too quiet for the vast emptiness surrounding them. Elias didn't move immediately, his instinct sharpening. He could feel Nayline behind him, her presence still cautious but steady. The rider was dressed in a worn but sturdy coat, a wide-brimmed hat shielding his face from the sun. His hands rested casually on the reins, but Elias noticed a rifle slung over his shoulder. The man wasn't making any sudden moves, but he wasn't showing any signs of friendliness either. Elias had learned long ago that men who wandered these lands were often in need of something: water, food, a place to rest. But those who stopped without a word usually wanted something more, something that couldn't be bargained for. He wasn't sure if this rider had come with intentions of peace or trouble. Nayline, sensing the tension, took a step back, her hand inching toward the rock at her side. Elias placed a steady hand on her shoulder, his touch reassuring but firm. He didn't want her to act out of fear. The rider finally halted a few paces from them, his horse shifting beneath him. There was a brief moment of silence before the man spoke. "Can I help you folks?" His voice was gravelly, but there was no malice in it, just the weariness of someone used to the land, used to survival. Elias regarded him with a cool gaze. "Just passing through," he said simply. He didn't give anything away. There was no reason to. The truth was, he didn't know if he was lying or not. His entire life had been about moving through places, leaving no trace behind, keeping his past hidden. He wasn't about to start telling this man his life story now. The rider gave a slight nod, as if he'd expected the answer. "The road gets rough ahead," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "A storm's brewing." Elias squinted into the distance, noticing the dark clouds gathering on the horizon. The man was right. A storm was coming, and fast. The desert had a way of shifting in the blink of an eye, turning from searing heat to an unforgiving downpour. "I'm headed for Dry Needle," Elias said, deciding to be truthful about their destination. "Need to get there before the storm hits." "Dry Needle, huh?" The rider mused. "You got a place to stay there?" Elias hesitated, his fingers tightening around his canteen. "Not exactly." The man eyed him for a long moment, and Elias braced himself for whatever was coming next. He wasn't sure whether the rider intended to offer help, or if he was about to become a threat. "You'll be needing shelter if you don't want to be caught out in that storm," the rider said finally, his voice softer now. "Dry Needle isn't much, but I know a place where you can wait it out." Elias nodded slowly, glancing back at Nayline. She had remained silent, studying the rider, her face unreadable. Elias could sense her hesitation. She didn't trust anyone easily, and neither did he. But the storm was coming, and they didn't have many options. If they were to survive out here, they needed to accept that some things were beyond their control. Sometimes, survival meant putting aside your pride and accepting help when it was offered. "Lead the way," Elias said. The rider nodded, then turned his horse toward the distant ridge. Elias followed, with Nayline walking closely behind him, her cautious footsteps barely audible over the wind picking up. As they reached the ridge, the storm clouds grew darker, swirling above them like a storm about to erupt. The desert's heat, once unbearable, now felt like the calm before the storm. Elias had spent his life in the wild, but the intensity of this storm, its suddenness and fury, was something he had never gotten used to. It was a reminder of just how small he was in the face of nature. They reached the rider's shelter just as the first raindrops began to fall, sharp and cold against their skin. The small cabin was little more than a shack, made of rough hewn wood with a single door and a low, slanted roof. The wind howled, pushing against the walls, but inside, the fire crackled warmly. The rider dismounted first and gestured for Elias and Nayline to follow. As they entered, Elias noticed the humble surroundings: simple wooden chairs, a small table, and a bedroll by the fire. There was no luxury here, just the bare necessities. But it was enough. It would do for the night. The rider didn't say much after they were inside. He moved the fire and stoked it, throwing in some dry kindling. Elias took a seat by the door, his hand resting on his revolver, ready for whatever came next. Nayline sat near the fire, her eyes still guarded but calmer now. Elias noticed the way her body had relaxed slightly since entering the shelter. Even though the storm was raging outside, there was a quiet sense of safety here, something that neither of them had felt in a long time. As the storm outside raged, the cabin became a small island of warmth and light. Elias watched the flames flicker and dance, thinking about the road ahead, the uncertain future. He didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel so alone. The rider finally spoke, his voice breaking the silence. "You're a long way from anywhere," he said, his eyes flicking between Elias and Nayline. "Both of you." Elias met his gaze, then nodded. "We're used to it." The rider raised an eyebrow. "Used to being alone?" Elias paused, then answered slowly. "Used to surviving." There was a quiet understanding in the rider's expression, but he didn't push any further. The silence between them stretched on, comfortable in its own way. Outside, the wind howled, but inside the cabin there was peace. As the fire crackled and the storm continued to rage outside, Elias and Nayline shared a quiet meal with their unexpected companion. The food was simple, but it tasted better than anything they'd had in days. Nayline ate slowly, her gaze fixed on the fire. Elias could see the exhaustion in her posture, the weight of her past still hanging on her shoulders. But there was something else, too, something in the way she moved, the way she looked at him now. It was the beginning of something different. The storm outside was relentless, but it didn't matter. They were here, together, in this small cabin, and for the first time in a long while, the desert didn't feel so empty. The silence between them had been filled with the shared understanding of survival, of shared burdens and the silent promise to keep going. The night grew deeper, and the storm continued to howl outside, but in the cabin, there was peace. Elias lay down on his bedroll, the warmth of the fire keeping the cold at bay. He could feel the weight of his past still heavy on his chest, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was carrying it alone. Tomorrow, the storm would pass. The road would open up again. But tonight, they were safe. Tonight, they had found something more than just survival. They had found a small, quiet kind of peace. And for both of them, that was enough.